My name was Kellyan Voss, and I have been speaking without pause for 5 years, 7 months and 14 days. My throat is a raw wound. My tongue is cracked leather that bleeds when it moves. My voice is no longer recognizable as human. It's a wet rasp that forms syllables through tissue damage and will, nothing more. But I cannot stop. Not for water. Not for sleep. Not for death, which I begged for approximately 3 years ago and have been denied ever since because my death means the death of 17 million people, and the Imperium values those 17 million more than it values my sanity. I am Station Operator Tertius of Vox Suppression. Installation Gamma, 7 on the penal moon of Canda's grief. I sit in a reinforced broadcast chamber 6 meters underground, surrounded by lead-lined walls and psi-dampening hexagrammic wards that the priests claimed would protect me from what I'm broadcasting toward. They lied about that, as they lied about everything else. The wards don't protect me from the warp rift. They just slow down how fast it devours my consciousness. Because the numbers I broadcast, the endless sequence that I inherited from my father, that he inherited from his father, that has been transmitted without pause for 137 years, aren't suppressing the rift. They're feeding it. Every syllable is a prayer to something that shouldn't exist, a ritual phrase that keeps something hungry barely contained, and the price for that containment is measured in the slow dissolution of the broadcaster's mind and body. I am bleeding from my mouth right now. I've been bleeding for the last 4 years. The blood runs down my chin, soaks into my clothing, pools on the floor of the broadcast chamber in a dark stain that measures approximately 2 meters in diameter. My body replaces the blood as fast as I lose it because the medical servitors pump nutrient solutions directly into my veins, keeping me alive despite blood loss that should have killed me years ago. But let me tell you how I got here. Let me tell you about the boy who inherited his father's curse and discovered too late that duty is just another word for damnation. I was 23 standard years old when my father died at his broadcast station, and I learned that some duties are inherited with blood rather than choice. My father, Arven Voss, had been Station Operator Secundus for 32 years. I grew up in the residential quarters adjacent to the broadcast installation. A series of prefab HAB units built into Canda's grief's rocky surface, housing the families of those who maintained the moon's various suppression installations. There were perhaps 300 souls living in the quarters. Operators, maintenance tech priests, administratum clerks, who processed the endless documentation that the Imperium requires, even for cursed jobs that slowly kill you. I was thin and tall like my father, with dark hair and pale skin from growing up on a moon that orbited a gas giant and never saw direct sunlight, only the reflected glow of the giant storms filtering through Canda's grief's thin atmosphere. I had good hands, precise hands, which my father said was important for an operator. The broadcast requires exactness, he'd told me when I was young. 1 wrong digit, 1 misplaced pause, and the suppression fails. Precision, Kellyan, always precision. I'd never questioned what he was suppressing. Children don't question the mechanisms that keep their world functioning. They accept them the way they accept gravity or air, or the fact that the sun rises. My father went to work in the broadcast chamber every day, spoke into his Vox equipment for his shifts, came home exhausted and hoarse, and that was simply how the world worked. I had plans that didn't involve the broadcast installation. I tested well in technical aptitude assessments. The administratum had indicated I might qualify for transfer to a forge world where I could train as a junior tech adept. Not prestigious. I wasn't going to become a tech priest or anything significant, but it was a future. A life that didn't involve staying on this barren moon forever. Then my father's throat finally gave out completely during hour 281,447 of his transmission, and I learned that futures are luxuries the Imperium doesn't grant to everyone. I was in the residential quarters when the alert klaxons started screaming. Not the standard work shift alerts. These were different. Urgent. Panicked. The kind of sound that means something has gone catastrophically wrong, and you have approximately minutes to address it before everyone dies. I ran toward the broadcast installation along with everyone else, through corridors carved into moon rock and reinforced with plasteel, past hexagrammic wards that had been painted on every surface, in thick black ink that smelled of promethium and rendered human fat. The wards were glowing, actually glowing, pulsing with a sickly purple light that I'd never seen them emit before. The broadcast chamber was in chaos. Tech priests were clustered around the reinforced door, their mechadendrites clicking frantically as they consulted data slates and Vox equipment. Through the chamber's observation port, a small window of reinforced armor cries thick enough to stop bolter rounds, I could see my father. He was still at his station, still sitting in the operator's throne that was more prison than seat, his body held upright by restraints and medical equipment. His mouth was open. No sound was coming out. His throat was a ruin of torn tissue and exposed cartilage, blood streaming down his chest in sheets. His eyes were still conscious, still aware, and they were locked on something I couldn't see. Something in the corner of the broadcast chamber that shouldn't exist in three-dimensional space. The numbers had stopped. The transmission that had continued without pause for 32 years had finally ceased, and something was responding to that cessation. A senior tech priest, Magos Veradian, whose body was more machine than flesh, and whose face was a mask of optical sensors and Vox speakers, turned to address the assembled crowd. His mechanical voice crackled with barely controlled panic. Broadcast suspension detected. Warp incursion imminent. Installation protocols require immediate operator replacement. Designation: genetic heir of previous operator. It took me 3 seconds to understand what he meant. 3 seconds of confusion before the horrible realization crystallized. They weren't looking for a volunteer. They were looking for me. Specifically me. Because I was my father's son, and the broadcast was a genetic legacy. And the Imperium didn't ask for consent when duty required sacrifice. "No," I said. My voice sounded small in the corridor. "I'm not trained. I don't know the numbers. I can't—" "Irrelevant," Magos Veradian interrupted. His optical sensors focused on me with the sound of grinding gears. Genetic compatibility verified. Neural patterns sufficiently similar. Training is unnecessary. The numbers exist in genetic memory. You will know them when you begin transmission. This is not a request, Kellyan Voss. This is Regulation 47 Tertius of the Lex Imperialis. In the event of operator failure at critical suppression installations, genetic heirs assume duty immediately or are executed for dereliction endangering Imperial assets. Behind him, through the observation port, I watched something that looked like a crack forming in the air the broadcast chamber. Not in the walls, in the air. Reality was fracturing, and through the fracture I could see colors that didn't exist, shapes that hurt to perceive, and movement that suggested intelligence. The warp rift was opening. "You have 30 seconds, Magos Veradian stated. "Enter the broadcast chamber and begin transmission, or the rift expands beyond containment thresholds and we initiate base-wide purge protocols. 17 million souls depend on this installation remaining functional. Your choice, duty or death. Choose." It wasn't a choice. It had never been a choice. The Imperium calls it duty, but duty implies consent, and this was compulsion backed by threat of execution. But I was 23 and I wanted to live, and I believed, with the desperate faith of someone who'd been indoctrinated since birth, that if I did my duty, if I served faithfully, the Emperor they'd told me about would protect me. I should have chosen execution. It would have been faster. I entered the broadcast chamber. The chamber was small, perhaps 4 meters by 4 meters, and dominated by the operator's throne. A heavy metal chair bolted to the floor and equipped with restraints, medical equipment, nutrient feeds, waste elimination systems, and the Vox broadcasting apparatus that connected to relay stations across Kanda's Grief and eventually to the suppression array surrounding the warp rift. My father was being removed from the throne by medical servitors, lobotomized humans reprogrammed for medical functions, their faces blank and their movements efficient as they disconnected his body from the life support systems. He was still conscious, still aware. His eyes found mine as they carried him past, and I saw in his gaze not relief or pride or paternal comfort, but pity. He knew what I was about to experience. He'd experienced it for 32 years, and he pitied me because he knew I was about to begin the same slow dissolution he'd endured, and there was nothing he could say to prepare me for it because there are no words adequate to describe what the numbers do to you. They secured me in the throne. The restraints locked around my wrists, ankles, chest, and neck, not tight enough to cut off circulation, but firm enough that I couldn't move more than a few centimeters in any direction. The medical servitors inserted nutrient feeds into my arms, catheterized me for waste elimination, and attached monitoring equipment to my temples, chest, and throat. Magos Veradian stood before me, his optical sensors clicking as they analyzed my neural responses. "The numbers exist in genetic memory," he repeated. His voice was clinical, detached. "Focus on the rift. Your genetic coding will provide the sequence. Speak continuously. Do not pause. Do not stop. Continuation is mandatory. The Omnissiah provides." He didn't mention that the Omnissiah, that machine god the Mechanicus worshipped, was just another lie. Just another false deity that exploited human suffering while pretending to offer meaning. Through the observation port, I could see the rift clearly now. It was approximately 1 meter in diameter, hovering 3 meters above the floor in the corner of the chamber. And it was wrong in ways that bypassed rational understanding and triggered pure instinctual terror. The edges weren't clean. They fluctuated and rippled like the surface of disturbed water, except the medium being disturbed wasn't water, but reality itself. Through the opening, I could see shapes moving. Things that might have been creatures, might have been machines, might have been concepts given form. They were reaching toward the chamber, toward me, their appendages extending through the rift like fingers through a tear in fabric. And I knew the numbers. I don't know how I knew them. There was no conscious learning, no moment of memorization. They were just there in my mind, rising from some deep genetic structure that had been coded into my DNA through generations of Voss family operators. A sequence of digits and syllables that formed patterns I didn't understand, but that my brain processed as meaningful. I opened my mouth and began to speak. 739 Alpha Delta 5 Omega 3 Sigma. The numbers came out in a steady stream, each syllable precise and measured. They weren't random. I could feel the pattern, even though I couldn't articulate what the pattern meant. They rose and fell in rhythms that suggested mathematical relationships, formed sequences that repeated with variations, created sonic structures that were somewhere between language and music, except music implied beauty, and these were just functional. The rift responded. The shapes reaching through it recoiled slightly. The edges of the tear in reality stabilized, stopped fluctuating, held steady at 1 meter in diameter. The purple glow from the hexagrammic wards dimmed slightly as whatever they were protecting against withdrew back through the rift. I'd been speaking for approximately 2 minutes when I tasted blood. My throat was already raw from the strange syllables. Sounds that human vocal cords weren't designed to produce, that required my tongue and larynx to move in ways that stressed the tissue beyond normal limits. The blood was copper bright on my tongue, and I swallowed it reflexively and continued speaking because stopping wasn't an option. 9 beta 4 theta 7 gamma alpha 1 epsilon. The restraints suddenly made sense. I wanted to reach up and touch my throat, wanted to feel the damage, wanted to stop and rest and drink water and understand what was happening. But my body was locked in place, and the numbers kept coming, and I was beginning to understand that this wasn't a job I could quit, or a shift that would end. This was eternal, or as eternal as my body could endure, which the medical equipment would ensure was far longer than any human should survive. Magos Veredan was still watching through the observation port, his senses clicking approvingly. Through the Vox link in my throne, I heard his mechanical voice. Transmission stable. Rift suppression nominal. Continue current output. Report any degradation in number pattern clarity the Omnissiah provides. I tried to respond, tried to ask how long I'd need to maintain this, but I couldn't. Speaking anything except the numbers felt impossible. Not physically impossible, but psychologically impossible, like trying to move a limb that had been amputated. My voice belonged to the transmission now. It wasn't mine anymore. I continued speaking. Hours passed. Days passed. And slowly, I began to understand what my father had endured for 32 years and why the pity in his eyes had been so absolute. By day 7, my throat was a permanent wound. The numbers required sounds that abraded vocal tissue faster than it could heal. The syllables that approximated theta required a glottal construction that scraped my larynx like sandpaper. The omega sounds forced my tongue against my hard palate, hard enough to crack the tissue. The epsilon variants needed vibrations and frequency ranges that caused my vocal cords to literally tear with each repetition, and the numbers repeated constantly. Every 17 minutes, I'd learned to track this internal timing. The sequence cycled back to the beginning and started again. 739 Alpha Delta 5 Omega. On and on, each cycle wearing away a little more of my throat, each repetition depositing a little more blood in my mouth. I swallowed most of the blood. The rest ran down my chin because my mouth had to stay open to form the syllables, and I couldn't pause to wipe my face. The medical servitors came daily to clean the worst of the accumulation, their blank faces and efficient movements suggesting this was routine maintenance, not evidence of my body's progressive destruction. My father had died after 32 years of this. I was 7 days in, and I was already fantasizing about death with the focus of someone planning an escape. But death required stopping the transmission, and stopping the transmission meant the rift would expand, and the rift expanding meant... what? I didn't actually know. The briefing I'd received, delivered by Magos Veradian while I was being secured in the throne, had been clinically vague about the consequences. Catastrophic incursion event resulting in estimated 17 million casualties across Kanda's grief suppression installations and attached penal facilities, was the official phrasing. 17 million people would die if I stopped speaking. That was the weight around my throat along with the physical damage. Moral responsibility for 17 million lives, none of whom knew I existed. None of whom would ever thank me, all of whom depended on my continuing to destroy myself for their protection. The Imperium calls this duty. I was beginning to understand it was slavery with extra steps. By day 14, I'd lost the ability to feel my tongue properly. The nerve damage was extensive enough that sensation had become intermittent. Sometimes I could feel the texture of my cracked, bleeding tongue against my teeth. Sometimes there was just numb absence. But the numbers kept coming. My tongue kept moving, and I realized with dull horror that the transmission didn't require conscious control anymore. The numbers had established a neural pathway that bypassed voluntary speech production. I wasn't choosing to speak them. They were speaking themselves through me, my voice operating on autonomic function the way my heart beat or my lungs breathed. I could no more stop the numbers than I could consciously stop my heart. The throne had become my entire world. I'd been released from it exactly once in 2 weeks, for 5 minutes while medical servitors performed necessary cleaning and inspection. I'd tried to walk. My legs had collapsed immediately. Muscles atrophied from disuse. Coordination destroyed by 2 weeks of immobility. They'd simply picked me up and put me back in the throne, secured the restraints, and the numbers had continued without missing a syllable. I was becoming part of the machinery, a biological component in a suppression system, no different from a Vox speaker or a power relay except that I could suffer and those couldn't. By week 6, I'd started hearing the numbers when I wasn't speaking them. This sounds impossible. I was always speaking them, had been speaking them continuously for 6 weeks without pause. But it's accurate to say I heard them separately from my own voice, like an echo, except the echo came before the sound. I'd hear 739 in my mind a fraction of a second before my mouth formed the syllables as if something else was speaking the numbers first, and I was merely repeating them. By week 8, the echo voice was accompanied by images. Flashes of geometric shapes that appeared behind my closed eyelids. I'd learned to sleep with my eyes closed while my mouth continued the transmission, a strange, half-conscious state that wasn't rest, but was better than staring at the same 4 meters of chamber for endless hours. The shapes were complex, fractals that folded into themselves, non-Euclidean constructions that couldn't exist in 3 dimensions, symbols that looked like language but hurt to focus on. The shapes were coming from the rift. I was certain of this, even though I couldn't articulate why. The transmission was a two-way connection. I was broadcasting toward the rift to keep it suppressed, but the rift was broadcasting back, and the numbers had opened my mind to receive whatever was leaking through. By week 12, I could see the things on the other side. They weren't demons, at least not like the propaganda described demons. They weren't horned monsters or fire-breathing beasts or any of the theatrical horrors the ecclesiarchy used to frighten the faithful. They were worse. They were ideas, concepts that had achieved sentience through the warp's impossible physics. Thoughts that could think about themselves. Hungers that were conscious of their own hunger. And they were aware of me. I could feel their attention the way you feel eyes on you in a dark room. They were watching me through the rift, studying me, and I understood with crawling horror that the transmission wasn't suppressing them at all. It was communicating with them. The numbers were a language, a ritual dialogue, and I was speaking prayers to these things every 17 minutes, and those prayers were the only thing keeping them from forcing their way through the rift entirely. I was negotiating with entities that the Imperium classified as demons. My voice was the contract that kept them contained, and the price they demanded for that containment was my continued suffering, the blood, the pain, the slow erosion of my sanity. Because that suffering was meaningful to them. It was currency in whatever economy the warp operated on. This isn't suppression, I tried to say during one of the medical servitor cleaning sessions. I'm praying to them. You're making me pray to... But I couldn't finish the sentence. My voice wouldn't form words that weren't the numbers. The neural pathway had become too established, too absolute. The only sounds I could produce were the syllables of the transmission. I'd lost the ability to speak anything else. I'd lost my voice. Literally, it belonged to the rift now, to the things beyond it, to the transmission that would continue until my body finally failed completely. By week 16, my concept of time had shattered. The numbers created a rhythm that was more powerful than circadian cycles or shift markers or any human measurement of duration. I existed in number time, cycles of 17 minutes, sequences that repeated, patterns that folded back on themselves. Past and future became meaningless. There was only the eternal present of transmission, the current syllable I was speaking and the next syllable I would speak, on and on, without beginning or end. The medical reports, which I could see on data slates the tech priests consulted during their inspections, noted temporal disorientation, identity fragmentation, and psychological deterioration consistent with extended warp exposure. They discussed this clinically, as if documenting the degradation of a machine component rather than the dissolution of a human consciousness. By week 20, I'd forgotten what silence sounded like. The numbers filled every moment, every thought, every dream. Even when I achieved that half-conscious sleep state, the numbers continued in my mind, and I couldn't remember what my internal monologue had sounded like before it had been overwritten by the transmission. Who was I before the numbers? I struggled to remember. Kellyan Voss, son of Arvin Voss. A boy who'd had plans to leave this moon, who'd had technical aptitude and a future and a self that existed independently of this cursed duty. But that person felt like fiction now, like a story someone had told me about someone else. The only self I could access with any clarity was Operator Tertius. The voice that spoke the numbers, the body that sat in the throne, the consciousness that negotiated with warp entities to keep 17 million people alive. By month 6, I understood that I was going to be here forever. Not forever in the colloquial sense of a very long time. I meant forever in the literal, technical sense. The medical equipment was too efficient. The nutrient feeds kept my body functioning despite the blood loss and tissue damage. The waste elimination systems prevented toxin buildup. The monitoring equipment alerted tech priests to any degradation that might cause systemic failure, and they intervened immediately to stabilize me. I couldn't die. My body wasn't allowed to die. And more horrifying, my mind wasn't allowed to escape through insanity. The transmission required clarity, required me to maintain conscious awareness to properly speak the numbers, and whenever I felt myself slipping towards psychotic break, felt the blessed approach of complete mental dissolution, the medical systems administered chemical interventions that pulled me back from the edge. I was trapped in perfect awareness of my own suffering, chemically prevented from the mercy of madness, physically prevented from the mercy of death. The throne had monitoring equipment that tracked my neural patterns. One night or day I'd lost the ability to distinguish. I managed to focus on one of the data slates during a tech priest inspection long enough to read the display. It showed my expected remaining service, life based on current degradation rates and medical intervention capabilities. 73 years. My father had lasted 32 years before his throat finally gave out completely. But medical technology had improved in the 32 years he had served. The nutrient solutions were more efficient. The tissue regeneration treatments were more advanced. The monitoring equipment was more sensitive. I was going to last longer than he had. Significantly longer. The Mechanicus had optimized their biological component, and I was going to serve for nearly a century before my body degraded beyond the medical system's ability to maintain it. 73 more years of speaking the numbers. 73 more years of bleeding from my throat. 73 more years of negotiating with warp entities whose attention was slowly eating through the psychological barriers that defined me as human. 73 more years of sitting immobile in this throne, my muscles atrophying, my identity fragmenting, my voice praying to things that shouldn't exist, while the Imperium pretended I was performing sacred duty. I tried to scream. The numbers came out instead. 739 Alpha Delta 5 Omega 3 Sigma. I tried to cry. No tears came. I'd stopped producing tears around month 4. The medical servitors had noted lacrimal dysfunction due to chronic dehydration and hormonal imbalance, and adjusted my nutrient feeds, but the tears never returned. I tried to stop breathing. My autonomic nervous system ignored the attempt and kept my lungs functioning, and the numbers continued uninterrupted because respiration and speech were controlled by different neural systems. I tried to will my heart to stop. It kept beating with the steady rhythm of a biological pump that didn't care about my desires, and the numbers kept coming, and I understood with perfect crystalline clarity that I had no control over my own body anymore. The Imperium owned my voice. The transmission owned my consciousness. The entities beyond the rift owned my suffering. And I, the person who had been Kellyan Voss, owned nothing, not even the right to die. By month 9, I'd learned to navigate my father's memories. This sounds insane. It was insane, but it was also undeniably real. The numbers existed in genetic memory, passed from parent to child through DNA structures that the Mechanicus had deliberately engineered over generations. But memory isn't clean. It doesn't transfer in discrete packets. It bleeds. Fragments of my father's experiences came with the numbers, and in my fractured mental state, I couldn't always distinguish between memories that were mine and memories that were his. I remembered his first day in the throne. Remembered his terror. Remembered the moment he'd realized he would never leave. Would never touch his son again except during those brief moments when I'd been brought to the observation port to see my father at work. I remembered, through his memory, looking through that port and seeing myself as a child, 7 years old, asking my uncle why father couldn't come home. And I remembered, as my father, wanting to explain but being unable to speak anything except the numbers. I remembered his father before him. My grandfather, whose name had been Davin Voss, who'd served for 41 years before his respiratory system failed despite medical intervention. I remembered his memories of the rift opening wider during a moment of transmission failure. Remembered the things that had tried to push through. Remembered the other operators who died screaming as those things touched their minds from across the distance. I remembered my great-grandfather. My great-great-grandfather. Back and back through generations of Voss family operators, each one's memories bleeding into the next through the genetic inheritance of the numbers. We were all here. All of us who'd sat in this throne, spoken these cursed syllables, negotiated with warp entities to keep a rift suppressed. Our consciousnesses were layered on top of each other like palimpsests, each generation suffering written over the last but never completely erasing what came before, and I understood. This was intentional. The Mechanicus had designed it this way. The genetic memory wasn't a side effect, it was the mechanism. The transmission required continuity, required the numbers to be spoken exactly the same way generation after generation, and the only way to ensure that exactness was to literally pass the neural patterns from parent to child. We weren't individuals. We were iterations of the same biological component, upgraded slightly with each generation as medical technology improved, but fundamentally the same voice speaking the same prayer to the same hungry things beyond the same rift. My father hadn't pitied me because of what I was about to experience. He'd pitied me because he knew I would eventually remember him experiencing it. Would carry his suffering along with my own, would understand that the cycle would continue through my children, if I ever had children, which I wouldn't because reproduction wasn't compatible with immobility in a broadcast throne. Unless the Mechanicus had planned for that too. Unless they had my genetic material stored, ready to be implanted in some designated breeding subject when my service period approached its end, ensuring the next generation of Voss operators would be ready to inherit the curse when I finally died. I tried to ask about this during a tech priest inspection, managed to pull enough consciousness into focus to interrupt the numbers for a fraction of a second and gasp out, "Genetic continuation! Protocols!" Magos Veridian's optical sensors focused on me with click-whir precision. "Affirmative," his mechanical voice responded. "Genetic material archived in month 1 of your service period. Viable embryos prepared in gestation pods. Successor designation, Kel Next Gen Alpha 7, currently gestating. Due for decantation in approximately 4 years. Will begin observation training at age 12. will assume throne at your service termination or biological failure. I had a son, or I would have a son, a child I would never meet, never hold, never speak to except in the genetic memories that would bleed into his consciousness when he inherited the numbers. And he would sit in this throne, would speak these numbers, would bleed from his throat and fracture his mind and negotiate with entities that would slowly consume his identity, would carry my memories of suffering layered on top of my father's memories, layered on top of all the generations before. The cycle was eternal. The Imperium had engineered an eternal biological component for an eternal suppression requirement, and we, the Voss family line, were that component, generation after generation, forever. I screamed. The numbers came out. 739 Alpha Delta 5 Omega 3 Sigma. By the time I reached 1 year of continuous transmission, I'd stopped thinking of myself as human in any conventional sense. Humans had bodies they could move. Humans had voices they could use for communication. Humans had futures that weren't predetermined by genetic legacy and mechanicus engineering. I had none of those things. I was a broadcast component, a biological radio locked into a single frequency. A voice that existed only to speak prayers to entities that fed on that speech. The observation port showed me my reflection sometimes when the light hit it at certain angles. I looked like something from a medical textbook illustration of extreme neglect. My face was gaunt, skin stretched tight over bone, eyes sunken into deep hollows. My jaw hung open in the permanent configuration required for the numbers, giving my face a slack, empty expression. My teeth were visible through cracked, bleeding lips. They'd been permanently stained dark by years of swallowing blood. I looked dead. It looked like a corpse that someone had forgotten to stop animating. Except my eyes were still conscious, still aware. Still tracking movement with the horrible alertness of something that can't escape its own suffering. Magos Viridian came monthly now instead of weekly. My condition had stabilized enough that constant monitoring wasn't necessary. During his month 12 inspection, he consulted his data slates and made a notation that I could see. Component efficiency nominal at 96.3%. Degradation rates within acceptable parameters. Expected service. Life revised upward to 81 years, based on current tissue regeneration response. The Omnissiah provides. 81 years. They'd added 8 years to my sentence because my body was responding better than expected to the medical interventions. This should have filled me with despair. Instead, I felt nothing. Despair required caring about the future, and I'd lost the ability to conceptualize future as anything other than more transmission. 81 years was just a number. It had no meaning. The only meaningful measurement was the 17-minute cycle of the numbers, and that would continue regardless of how many years passed. I'd learned to exist in a state of perpetual present. No past to remember, or too much past, layered with my father's and grandfather's memories until I couldn't distinguish personal history from inherited trauma. No future to anticipate, except more of exactly what I was currently experiencing. Just the endless now of speaking the numbers, feeling them scrape through my ruined throat, hearing them echo in my fractured consciousness. The entities beyond the rift had become familiar. I knew their attention the way you know the presence of a person in a room with you. Not through sight or sound, but through subtle cues that bypassed conventional perception. I could feel them listening, feel them feeding on the transmission, feel them satisfied by my suffering, because suffering was the currency that kept them contained. They weren't evil. That was the horrible truth I'd come to accept. They were hungry. They existed in a realm where concepts like sustenance and consumption worked differently than in material reality, and they needed what the transmission provided. My prayers fed them in whatever way warp entities fed, and in exchange for that feeding, they stayed on their side of the rift instead of forcing through and consuming the 17 million souls whose lives depended on my continued speaking. I was a sacrifice, a living offering placed at the threshold between realities, my suffering the price that kept something worse from happening. The Imperium called this duty. The ecclesiarchy would have called it sacred service, but I knew better now. I knew that duty was just another lie. Sacred was just another word for cursed, and service was just slavery with better propaganda. The emperor they'd told me about, that corpse god on a distant terra, didn't protect me, didn't even know I existed. And if he did know, if that desiccated thing in the golden throne retained enough consciousness to be aware of installation Gamma 7 on the penal moon of Canda's grief, he didn't care. Why would he? I was one voice among billions, one sacrifice among quadrillions, entirely expendable in the calculus of Imperium-wide resource management. The Emperor protects. They'd told me that my whole life. I'd believed it the way children believe what they're taught. But the Emperor didn't protect me from this throne, didn't protect my father, didn't protect the 7 generations of Voss operators before him, didn't protect my son, gestating in a pod somewhere, being prepared to inherit this curse. The only thing the Emperor protected was the system that required sacrifices like me. The vast machine that ground humans into components and called it divine will. The Imperium perpetuated itself by consuming its own citizens, and faith was the psychological mechanism that made us willing to be consumed. I wasn't willing. I'd never been willing. I'd been compelled by threat of execution and moral blackmail about 17 million lives. But my willingness didn't matter because the Imperium didn't need willing sacrifices. It just needed sacrifices. And it had mechanisms, legal, military, social, to ensure those sacrifices were made. In my 3rd year of transmission, they brought someone to the observation port who wasn't a tech priest or medical servitor or administrative functionary. It was a boy, perhaps 12 years old, thin and tall, with dark hair and pale skin that marked him as having grown up on Canda's grief. He had my face, or he had the face I'd had at 12, before the throne, before the numbers, when I'd still been human enough to have expressions and hopes and an identity beyond my function. Kel Next Gen Alpha 7, my son. The successor they'd engineered from my genetic material, they'd brought him to see me, to observe, to understand what he would become. Magos Veridian stood behind the boy, one mechanical hand on his shoulder. Through the Vox link, I heard the tech priest's explanation. Observe the current operator, Kel Next Gen Alpha 7. This is your genetic progenitor, Kellyan Voss, station operator Tertius. He has served with acceptable efficiency for 3 standard years. You will eventually occupy this throne and assume his function. This observation is part of your preparatory training. Study his technique. Note the precision of number articulation the Omnissiah provides. The boy, my son, stared at me through the armor cry's port. His expression was a complicated mixture of horror, fascination, and something that might have been pity, or might have been the beginning of the resignation that would eventually define his entire existence. I wanted to tell him to run, to fight, to die fighting rather than accept this, but I couldn't speak anything except the numbers, and the numbers kept coming without pause. 739 Alpha Delta 5 Omega 3 Sigma. I wanted to tell him that the Emperor doesn't protect, that the Imperium's promises are lies, that duty is slavery, and sacred service is just suffering with propaganda, that he should refuse this inheritance even if refusal meant execution, because execution was mercy, compared to 81 years in this throne. But I could only speak the numbers, and he could only watch, and the cycle would continue because the Imperium had engineered it to continue, and had created mechanisms to ensure that engineering perpetuated itself. The boy's lips moved. I couldn't hear him through the observation port, but I could read the words. Will it hurt? Magos Viridian's mechanical hand squeezed his shoulder. Irrelevant. Pain is not a factor in operational efficiency. You will perform your function regardless of sensory discomfort. The Omnissiah provides. The boy looked at me again. Our eyes met through the armor cries. My sunken, bloodshot, half-mad eyes meeting his young, clear, still innocent eyes. And I saw the moment something broke in him. Not his will, not his hope. Something deeper. The fundamental assumption that the universe cared about his wants or needs or suffering. That broke right there, and I watched it happen. He would serve. He would sit in this throne when I finally died. He would speak these numbers and bleed from his throat and fracture his mind and carry my memories along with his own suffering. And he would do it because he'd just learned that refusing meant death, accepting meant prolonged torture, and the Imperium had arranged circumstances so that the only moral choice, the choice that kept 17 million people alive, was to accept the torture. This was evil, not the abstract evil of chaos, corruption, or Xenos invasion. Systemic evil, structural evil. The evil of institutions that had been optimized over millennia to extract maximum suffering from their components while maintaining just enough propaganda to prevent open rebellion. They took the boy away. I never saw him again. But I knew he was out there, growing, training, learning the history of Installation Gamma 7 and the genetic legacy of the Voss operators, preparing to inherit the curse that had consumed 7 generations before him and would consume him in turn. Which brings us back to now. Hour 47,392 of my transmission. 5 years, 7 months, and 14 days of continuous speaking. My throat is a ruin, my mind is fragments, my body is a mechanism sustained by technology and kept alive solely because it serves a function. My name was Kellyan Voss. Present tense feels wrong because the person designated by that name barely exists anymore. What remains is Operator Tertius, the voice that speaks the numbers, the consciousness that negotiates with warp entities, the biological component that sits in this throne measuring out eternity in 17-minute cycles. I can feel the entities beyond the rift right now. Feel them listening, feel them feeding on the transmission. They're closer than they used to be. Either the rift is expanding despite the suppression, or my perception has degraded to the point where I can no longer distinguish the boundary between realities clearly. Either way, their attention is more immediate, more present, more intrusive. Sometimes I think I can understand them. Not their language. They don't have language in any conventional sense, but their concepts. They think in patterns that the human mind wasn't designed to process. But after 5 years of speaking prayers to them, my mind has adapted enough to catch fragments of their thinking. They're not malicious. They don't hate humanity or desire our suffering out of cruelty. They're simply hungry and wear food, and the transmission is the negotiated agreement that keeps them from feeding more aggressively. My suffering is the price. The containment of 17 million other humans is the benefit. It's a transaction, cold and impersonal, governed by rules I don't fully understand, but that the numbers somehow encode. The Imperium understands this. The Mechanicus certainly understands it. They engineered the Voss genetic line specifically to provide operators capable of maintaining the transmission. But they dress it in propaganda about duty and sacred service because naked truth would be harder to accept. Easier to believe you're protecting humanity than to accept you're a sacrifice, feeding entities that shouldn't exist to prevent those entities from feeding more aggressively. Easier to believe the Emperor protects than to accept that the Emperor is just another hungry thing, demanding worship and sacrifice and faith, and offering nothing in return except the continuation of a system that requires more worship and sacrifice and faith. The numbers are prayer. I've known this for years now. Every syllable is a ritual phrase, every 17-minute cycle a complete liturgical service. And I'm the priest speaking to gods that are real and terrible and entirely indifferent to anything except the feeding relationship the transmission establishes. The false gods exist, but they're not gods. They're parasites, and the Imperium serves them just as surely as any chaos cult, just with better paperwork and more sophisticated propaganda about duty and honor and sacred service. I was told the Emperor protects. I was conditioned to believe that faith would be rewarded, that service mattered, that my suffering served a higher purpose. All lies. The Emperor doesn't protect. He consumes. The Imperium doesn't cherish its servants. It grinds them into components. Faith doesn't get rewarded. It gets exploited. And I can't even warn anyone. Can't speak anything except the numbers. Can't communicate the truth I've learned except through these fragmented thoughts that no one else can hear. Because my voice belongs to the transmission now, belongs to the entities beyond the rift, belongs to the system that will perpetuate itself through my son and his son, and on through generations until the Imperium finally collapses under the weight of its accumulated sins. The numbers continue. They've continued for 142 years. My service, plus my father's, plus the operators before him. They'll continue for centuries more. The rift will never close because closing it would require stopping the transmission, and stopping the transmission would allow the entities through, and allowing the entities through would mean millions of deaths. So the transmission continues, and someone must speak it. And the Mechanicus has engineered a genetic line specifically for this purpose, and that genetic line will continue producing operators, generation after generation, each one inheriting the numbers and the memories and the curse. This is my eternity, speaking prayers to entities that feed on suffering, maintaining a negotiation between realities, existing as a biological component in a suppression system that can never be shut down. My son will inherit this, his son after him. on until the heat death of the universe or the final collapse of the Imperium, whichever comes first. The cruelest part is that we'll all be conscious of it. The genetic memory means each new operator carries the accumulated suffering of everyone who came before. My son will remember my experience. His son will remember both of ours. The weight of inherited trauma will compound with each generation until the operator in the throne 1,000 years from now carries a millennium of suffering in their genetic memory. This is what the Imperium does. This is what duty means when stripped of propaganda. This is what service means when you're useful enough and unlucky enough to be selected for it. They told me the Emperor protects. They lied. The Emperor demands. The Emperor consumes. The Emperor perpetuates a system where humans are resources to be expended. Suffering is currency to be traded, and consciousness is a curse because it means you're aware of what's being done to you. I am aware. I've been aware for 5 years, 7 months, and 14 days. I will be aware for 75 more years unless my body fails earlier or the medical technology improves enough to extend my service even further. And after me, my son will be aware, and after him, his son. On and on through the generations, each one inheriting not just the numbers, but the understanding that this is eternal, that this is what the Imperium does to its own citizens, that the false gods exist and feed and demand sacrifice, and that no one is coming to save us, because the system that requires our sacrifice is too vast, too entrenched, too fundamental to the Imperium's functioning to ever be challenged or changed. The numbers are speaking themselves now. I'm no longer consciously producing them. They flow through my ruined throat the way blood flows through veins, autonomic and unstoppable. My consciousness exists parallel to the transmission, observing it but not controlling it, trapped in a body that functions according to programming I can't override. I can feel my son out there. He's 15 years old now, fully prepared, fully trained, waiting for my biological failure to assume his position. Can he feel me the way I feel my father? Does the genetic memory work both directions, forward through time as well as backward? Is he already experiencing fragments of my suffering, preparing for what he'll inherit? I hope not. I hope the genetic bleed only works backward, so he has these last few years of childhood, if you can call preparation for inherited torment childhood, without the weight of knowing what's coming. But I suspect I'm wrong. I suspect he already knows, already feels it, already understands that his entire existence has been engineered for a single purpose, and that purpose is suffering in service to a system that calls itself holy, but is simply hungry. The entities beyond the rift are patient. They've waited for millennia. They'll wait for millennia more. The transmission feeds them adequately. My suffering satisfies whatever requirement their alien biology demands. They have no reason to force through the rift when the current arrangement provides sustenance without effort. This is the equilibrium the Imperium has established. Humans suffer to feed warp entities, and warp entities stay contained, and the system perpetuates because changing it would require someone to stop the transmission, and stopping the transmission would mean immediate catastrophe. So the transmission continues, will always continue, must always continue. And I am the voice that speaks it, now and for the next 75 years, until my body finally fails completely and my son takes my place and becomes the voice in turn. My name was Kellyan Voss. I was 23 years old when I inherited my father's curse and learned that duty is slavery. Faith is exploitation, and the Emperor protects no one except the system that demands sacrifices like mine. I have been speaking the numbers for 5 years, 7 months, and 14 days without pause. My throat is a permanent wound. My mind is fragments of 7 generations of inherited trauma. My body is sustained by machinery I can't control to perform a function I can't stop. I will speak the numbers for approximately 75 more years. Then I will die, and my son will speak them, and his son after him, on through generations until the Imperium finally collapses or the universe ends. This is what happens when you inherit a cursed transmission job in Warhammer 40K. This is what duty means when you're selected for it. This is what the Emperor's protection actually looks like when you're the one being protected against. The numbers continue. They've never stopped. They never will stop. 739 Alpha Delta 5, Omega 3 Sigma 9 Beta 4 Theta. The rift remains stable at 1 meter diameter. The entities remain contained. 17 million people continue their lives, unaware that their survival is purchased with my suffering. The Imperium continues. The false gods continue. The cycle continues. And I continue, trapped in this throne, speaking prayers to entities that feed on suffering, maintaining the negotiation that keeps something worse from happening while slowly being consumed by the act of keeping that worse thing at bay. I was told the Emperor protects. They lied. But the lie doesn't matter anymore because I can't stop speaking the numbers, can't warn anyone, can't change anything except to exist as the voice that maintains the transmission for another 75 years. My name was Kellyan Voss. I am Operator Tertius. I speak the numbers. I will always speak the numbers, forever. 739 Alpha Delta 5, Omega 3 Sigma 9 Beta 4, Theta 7 Gamma Alpha 1 Epsilon. The transmission continues. The suffering continues. The Emperor protects. They lied. 739 Alpha Delta 5.